I thought I'd spend a fair amount of time today kind of talking about how the exhibition came together, what it was like to jury this show, because it seems like that's been a lot of what people are really curious about as I've had conversations since I got into Iowa on Thursday. And I didn't really know exactly what to expect going into it, but I certainly did not expect to be reviewing over 1,000 images. And so the sheer number of works on its own was really impressive to me, and really, was an early indicator and signifier of the fact that regional art shows like this one are still immensely important, and that there are art centers all over the country, well beyond New York and Los Angeles, which we all know, but I think a lot of times people have blinders to really quickly when there's so much to absorb in those cities all the time. So going through those 1,000+ submissions is a little bit daunting at first, but the process for me was to kind of look through everything all at once and not make any judgments on the first pass, to really think about not just each work on its own terms, but also how things might play together in the same space. I mean, what we're always doing as curators is telling a story and making a point of some sort, and thinking about how works will feed off of each other. So after that point, I kind of went through and made some selections of things that I knew definitely wouldn't be in the show, and that either because they felt like outliers or maybe weren't as technically or conceptually accomplished as other pieces. And then the hard work really started. I still had probably 500 or 600 things to look at that point, and there were a few things that I was not sure if they would even work in the space. I had a number of emails sent to Stacy, how do you feel about projections and sculptures on the floor, and how many sculptures can we fit? I wasn't necessarily expecting to see a lot of work in three-dimensional media or in video or things that were performance adjacent, and that was also a huge surprise and a huge indicator of the ambition of the artists in this community and what could be done in this show, and that was really exciting too. So then as I went through and looked at the work and thought about it more and more, one of the challenges of a juried show is that you're curating it, but you're not curating from scratch. You're given a pool of things from which to pick, rather than from here is everything, or here is the artist that you are working on, and what are the best things for this person. In some ways, the artists that submit are kind of creating the thesis for you. And as a curator, you don't really like to be out of control. It's a little unnatural for us, since we're all a little type A and obsessive about everything. But I was very happy to let the art be the guide, and to have those themes emerge. And one of the things that really became clear too was that a lot of the ideas that artists in the show were grappling with were the same ideas that were being handled by contemporary artists around the country, and really even around the world. So it felt great to be able to put together a show that felt like, yes, it was a local show that reflected the region, but also one that spoke to broader concerns within contemporary art. And as the show started to get whittled down, that really became a guiding principle, that were this show not in Dubuque, would this art still have resonance? Would it still feel strong? And I feel completely confident in all 60 works in this show that is absolutely the case. And so that was really rewarding as well. And I think you feel it palpably in the galleries too, that in addition to these real technically accomplished explorations of design principles and formalism and experience with materials, that there was also a lot of anxiety felt in the work. And I think artists really looking at expressions of the body and femininity and bodily anxieties of memory, and using memory either as a source of solace or of pain, grappling with power structures, and also looking at nature, and particularly at the Midwestern landscape, as a source of harmony, as a place for reflection, and really also as something that could maybe absolve us of a particular moment as well. And so kind of ended up with three little clusters based around those ideas loosely. So the space that maybe half of you, the majority of you, are standing in now, which really ended up becoming largely because Rachel's pieces are so prominent, Rachel Merrill's pieces are so prominent within the show, but that was really focused on femininity and the body and the struggles around how we as individuals deal with the outside world and the expectations that that world puts upon us, and then really kind of focused in the gallery to my right on memory, on grief, on kind of more poignant expressions of anxiety there, and really focusing on memory too. And I think even Michael Knapstein's photographs, which are I'm directly facing, which are just these absolutely beautiful expressions of the landscape, are also definitely grounded in a memory and a sort of longing of a place at a particular moment, and looking to that maybe as some sort of resolution towards our present time, and while all the while being completely anchored in a certain American photographical tradition that we think about Walker Evans or Ansel Adams and people like that. And then behind me, I think both of those themes definitely continue. Certainly relationships to power structures in Martin Spy, Kathy Weaver's works, but also I really wanted to let the main gallery really have a sense of play, and let abstraction really come forward in those spaces as well. But an abstraction that kind of darted, the abstractions that seemed the strongest in the show really had this sense of layering and depth, and that felt like it wasn't just a formal exercise, that there was a sort of jetting in and out, and that when those works would be placed with works that were more expressionist or surrealistic in nature, that those threads would come into that work as well. So there is some kind of intentional placement there. I do also, in absentia, I think it's very important when we work in the arts to acknowledge the people that help us out. So in addition to the media staff, in her absence, I do want to thank my intern, Sabrina Lefkowitz, who worked for free. That's how you get started in the arts, it's free labor. Not a great system. Speaking of systems and power structures. But Sabrina did create a floor plan from scratch based on some numbers that Stacy had given us and some schematics, and then made quarter-inch scale maquettes of every single thing in the show so that I could lay it out before coming here. So, if you won't ever meet her probably, but just want to acknowledge her involvement in the show too. So with that, I think I'll start talking about some individual works, but if people have questions, it's Saturday afternoon, this does not have to be like school for you all. I want it to be enjoyable, and also to make sure that your queries get answered. So I'll leave some time at the end for sure, and we'll make myself available, not just in a group format, in case you feel like yours is a little bit more of a private concern, not for 50-something people. And I also want to acknowledge all the artists that are here. To those of you who made it, thank you for coming today, but also thank you for submitting your work. It really that is what makes the show, and I just put it into place. And I would also encourage you, if I am talking about your work, to speak up. You know about it better than I do, and I'm not super formal and would love to have a conversation. So please do feel free to interject. So I chose this part of the gallery to start talking in part so that I could talk about two clusters of work at once without really moving everybody around. And I'll start with Rachel Merrill's work, which I've already touched on a little bit. So Rachel's conceived of this video project of a performance that also has a sculptural component in these giant pom-poms that are on the ground, and then a sculptural / costume component in the work that you see on mannequins and that you see her wearing in the video. And the project really explores what it is that we do when we're performing womanhood, and challenges the expectations that are placed on us all the time. And I think she's very interested in this idea of being good sport and who that is as she's a person. But I think that's something that many of us feel, that you feel like you need to be accommodating in a certain way or go along with certain things. And look a certain way, act a certain way, etc. And that then by putting it into the arena of sports, I mean, I grew up as an athlete, but I think is in some ways still somewhat of a gendered thing. I mean, I think the fact that we pay our female athletes so much less than we pay our male athletes absolutely points to that fact. And then Rachel puts everything into this wonderful palette of paint. I feel like I've actually joined her little army of athletes today and what I chose to wear. But wears these completely nonsensical costumes that you wouldn't really be able to perform serious physical activity, and wears high heels for many of them too, and then goes through these repetitive motions that come up in like high intensity interval training, and ends up putting together what's essentially like a highlight reel for ESPN, but that you would never actually see on ESPN. And I think I made the choice to include all of the elements of the piece that really you could see that she's making the costumes too, and that every component of this work is something that she is bringing to the table. That it's not just the video, but that it exists in all of these different layers. Though I do think each piece works on its own as well. I think in some ways we can see her work is very related to the rhinestone encrusted chain by Ali Haval. Ali is also interested in ideas of femininity and recasting it, and so she's taking something that is generally very hard, that is metal, that is either used to contain people or prevent people from going into places that don't kind of have any sort of shiny magpie type characteristics to them, and then has encrusted them completely in rhinestones and hung it on a wall, which is kind of perfectly here purple, and then starts to challenge what we think of that form in doing so. And then behind, I guess I will back up here to talk simultaneously about Martin Spy and Kathy Weaver's work. Both of them are very interested in power structures and how those structures affect people. So this work by Martin is part of a broader series of these whitewood sculptures, and I will say he did submit more work than this one to this show, which were all great, but I was confronted with this space and realized that we weren't going to have a solo show of one artist for the Biennial. So, but this is part of a larger project, and this guy is called the King of Oblivion, and I think it's very easy for us to associate this character with our current president, although Martin has said that it's not necessarily about one person, but more about demagogues in general. But I think this piece being in Iowa in 2019 isn't necessarily an accident. But we see this person. We know that he's the person in power because of the crown on his head. That's actually kind of this is like funny little cut up things, not actually real regalia. But then we see him just like collapse on the floor, looking kind of drunk and sort of ineffective, and that all of his parts are kind of tenuously connected to one another. He doesn't really seem capable of doing much or asserting any power. And then I paired him with Kathy Weaver's drawings. These are 4 drawings in a series of 20, so there's a whole kind of narrative happening around these figures, and she's given names to them, and you can see, here again we've got this kind of funny little bullet missile ruler here. These people sort of swooping in to save the day or something, and here are all these little missile heads laughing to each other, but they're not. There's not really any sense necessarily that these guys are necessarily the good guys, these guys are necessarily the bad. The senses of who's on what side are a little bit confused, and how effective any side is a little bit in dispute, because none of them really seem capable of doing very much against. I think in that it's this broader critique of conflict and the broader issues that we get ourselves into. Said in the introduction was a space that I felt was really dedicated to struggle and memory and grief within that, and highlight first Elizabeth Eagle's paintings, these three to my left. These are from a series of work she calls her Lake House series, and they come from thinking through memories of going to the lake and what that would be like. And I think, the way that she's painted the works, where everybody's kind of in and out of focus, where the features aren't quite defined, but then there's, extreme levels of details in the bathing suits, for instance, or in what would be reflected in the windows. It really speaks to how our memory actually functions, that there are certain things that just completely escape us, but then other things that are somewhat inexplicably that are just in such sharp relief. And she talks about the kind of struggles in looking at the past and really relying on these life preservers, which of course are something that you would naturally find as at a lake house. So it is stemmed in that reality of those memories, but also nobody would really have this. And so she's using it as a metaphor, as a device for safety and safekeeping, and really doing the function of what they're called. And the two works, Julia Franklin's and Rachel Cox's, here also really pick up on this strand of memory, and specifically really memory as a source of pain. So Julia, please feel free to jump in if you would like, but has found all these letters from her father, who ended up committing suicide, and has reclaimed them and constructed them into one of his shirts as a way to really process that decision, and kind of coming to terms with somebody that you think you know so well, that sort of reveals themselves to. And I think we've all encountered this type of realization with a person, even if we haven't experienced the loss of somebody in that way that's close to us, but that in absence, people somehow suddenly become quite different than we think they are, that they're different from, two people can have different ideas of somebody entirely. And so this really grapples with that in this installation of this paper shirt hung onto the clothesline, and then with the photographs in the shirt pocket, but again clipped in with little clothespins to mimic formally what's going on here. And then Rachel Cox also deals with the death of her parents and her photographs. Her parents died a few years apart earlier in the decade, and she is taking a photograph of a funeral home and really recalling what that experience was like. And it's this scene that kind of looks completely mundane and that anybody could just walk into, but then when you actually think about the details that she's captured, and I think the tonality of the light in particular really gives it that sort of latent mood within it, but that you see that one of the only objects in the photograph is this box of tissues, and then you have all these rows as if assembled looking at something. So when you start thinking through why would the chairs be like this, and why would that be the only object that was there, I think you start to begin to think through what that setting is. But I think the other thing the chairs speak to, and that works particularly well within the setting of the funeral, is the absence of the body. That for all of the implication that there is a crowd or a gathering here, that it's actually devoid of the human presence, and in that way serves as a metaphor for the loss that she felt in the loss of her parents. The final space of the show, and as I said earlier, this was one where I was really thinking about the submissions of abstract work to the show and how they related to some of the broader concepts that were happening. And so to support that abstract work in part, I included a few figure paintings, and the three that are kind of coming in from the other space that I think really help continue the mood from the previous gallery into this one, but then also allow this wall, a salon hand wall of abstractions to kind of provide a bit of relief and a different tone too. There's certainly a different punctuation here. I think that a lot of these works feel very optimistic, even though to me there's also still a sense of struggle in the way that they're layered and composed. So whether it's through different media and different applications, and as in Mary Zieren's work, or here this is actually old paintings that have been cut up and then reassembled into one work. And Pamela, in her artist statement had this great, her statement was quite short, but had this great line about that work and the characters that it kind of alludes to. It said that they are not afraid, and I was like, oh, that's kind of the perfect point amongst all this work, that this is this sort of ray of hope that's coming from all these different things that are being assembled. Alyssa Mayr's work, these three pieces, and I would encourage you after we're done to come up close to look at this watercolor here. It definitely is subtle and reveals itself in closeness, and these were works that, because of how her name fell in the alphabet, were actually the first works I saw when I was reviewing the submissions in the show, and I'm just like, oh well, this is going to be good. Like, I'm really into these things, and at first I couldn't exactly pinpoint why, but I think especially as I started to look through some of the landscape photography in the show, and combined with the abstraction, that there was this idea of this invented landscape that sort of seemed bound to a dream world, and there was something coming from that, and some sort of sense of holiness in the way that these objects are sort of assembled as if in a ritual, that that this kind of perfect pink rock is surrounded by these trees, which presumably grows naturally that way. It seems like it has this sort of force in it that's sort of Stonehenge-y in its mysticism, and that the feathers going into this other object that seemed very solid felt that way too. So there is this kind of current of inexplicability, that it feels very surreal, but I think it also feels very powerful. And it was important to me that even if the show was expressing anxiety in a lot of places, that artists were dealing with death outright in some of them, that there was also this real sense of optimism that came through as well. And I think that tension between those two things is really expressive of the moment that we're in right now. So with that, I'll close out, but I'm again happy to take your questions, and if you want to ask the group, you're welcome to, but also I'll be around until the next talk begins at 2 o'clock if you want to just pull me aside. So thank you all. Thank you.
So after you had seen these 500, did you say?
Over 1,000.
1,000, whoa. You have your themes. So did you have those themes in general? Are they basic themes, or did you have, when you get the smaller group, then you're saying, okay, these fit, and did those themes eliminate some other pieces?
I didn't have any preconceived themes in mind of what I wanted the show to be, and I wanted the art to kind of let it figure itself out, and I didn't want to shoehorn anything in, but certain ideas definitely crept to the surface as I was looking at work and reading people's artist statements. And so it didn't eliminate anybody until later on in the process, where it was really getting down to, okay, what is actually going to fit, but also that idea that I spoke of at the very beginning of, that we as curators are, kind of have to have at least a loose narrative or story in mind. And so there was some work that was very accomplished that didn't end up in the show because it just didn't seem to work with the other things that I had selected. And I think there were also some pieces that were very conceptually strong that would have related to these ideas, but that technically or formally weren't quite there. And then also some really technically accomplished work that I just didn't feel like was as resonant. And I think for me, successful contemporary art is always functioning on both levels. That you have to get there on the conceptual side, and you have to get there on the technical side. And it's where those two things marry and support each other that you get something that's really, really great.
Great, Tracy.
Yeah.
So I have a couple questions, but the first one, just when I came in, I wasn't thinking about it last night, but when I was picking up the prospectus and looking at it, I think it's interesting. I just did a quick count using the photos that there are 13 men and 25 women. And how would that parallel to like the Whitney Biennial or other exhibitions?
Sure. Well,
I
I
mean,
mean,
in-
I
on the East
will
Coast.
say that was a kind of happy accident. I was during the show blind, so I had no idea of anybody's demographics within that. I do think it is, as far as group shows or museum shows around the country go, probably much more female than many, but the Whitney Biennial is basically 50-50 this time around, and I think, I think there's a lot of concerted work by curators to include voices of women, not only within contemporary art, but within histories as well. But I think there's also, now you have a lot of women who are working as curators who came up in an education system that was already focusing on revisionist history. I mean, my initial background at Cornell was in this idea of comparative modernities, and so that, that was invested in us from the outset. And I think there are also, just in general in the art world, much more support for female artists than there used to be too, and different expectations of them in a positive way.